The early morning sun painted the quiet suburban street in hues of soft gold, promising another uneventful day in the neighborhood, or so it seemed. Jeff, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a perpetual scowl, leaned against his porch railing, nursing a cup of bitter coffee. He liked to think of himself as the unofficial watchdog of the street, always ready to sniff out trouble. To Jeff, trouble often came in the form of anyone who didn't fit his narrow idea of who belonged in their idyllic cul-de-sac. As he glanced out, his sharp eyes caught movement across the street. A moving truck had pulled into the driveway of the vacant house at the corner. Jeff straightened, his gaze narrowing. He set his coffee mug down with a thud, his curiosity quickly giving way to suspicion as a tall, broad-shouldered black man stepped out of the truck. The man moved with an air of quiet confidence, carrying a box toward the front door. Jeff muttered under his breath, "Great, just what we need." He had spent years cultivating a misguided belief that his neighborhood was a safe haven because of people like him, and this newcomer didn't fit into his vision of how things should be. As the morning went on, Jeff's irritation grew. The man, who had introduced himself to a passing neighbor as Marcus, was busy unloading boxes, chatting amicably with the movers. He seemed polite, even cheerful, but to Jeff, every smile and wave was suspect. By mid-morning, Jeff's suspicion had curdled into action. He picked up his phone, dialing 911 with a practice ease. "Yeah, I'd like to report some suspicious activity," he said, glancing out the window to make sure Marcus was still outside. "There's a guy across the street. I don't know what he's up to, but he's got a truck full of stuff. Could be stolen for all I know. You might want to check it out." The dispatcher promised to send someone to investigate, and Jeff hung up, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. He watched from his window as a patrol car rolled into the neighborhood a short while later. Two officers stepped out and approached Marcus, who was mid-conversation with one of the movers. Jeff couldn't hear the exchange, but he saw Marcus smile and nod politely as he handed over some paperwork. The officers glanced at the documents, exchanged a few words with him, and then left without further incident. Jeff's satisfaction quickly turned to frustration. What kind of neighborhood watch is this? He grumbled to himself. They're just going to let him off like that. But Jeff wasn't done. His years of paranoia had taught him to double down when his suspicions weren't validated. Over the next few days, he made it his mission to keep a close eye on Marcus, peering through his blinds and jotting down every visitor, every delivery, every light that flickered on or off in the house. To Jeff, everything Marcus did was evidence of something sinister. Then one afternoon, as Marcus was unloading what looked like gym equipment from the back of his truck, Jeff decided to confront him directly. He stormed across the street, his chest puffed out, and his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Hey, what exactly are you doing here? You think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and do whatever you want?" Marcus, unfazed, set down the weights he was carrying and turned to face Jeff. His expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I'm just setting up my home gym," he said, his voice even. "Is there a problem?" Jeff's face flushed. "Problem? Yeah, there's a problem. People around here like to know who their neighbors are, and you haven't exactly been forthcoming." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I'm Marcus. Nice to meet you." He extended a hand, but Jeff ignored it, his jaw tightening. "I don't need your name," Jeff snapped. "I need to know what you're really doing here. People like you don't just move into neighborhoods like this." Marcus's gaze hardened slightly, though his tone remained measured. "People like me," he repeated, his voice carrying an edge of warning. Before Jeff could respond, the sound of another neighbor's door opening broke the tension. Mrs. Clark, an elderly woman who lived next door, stepped out onto her porch. "Everything all right over there?" she called, her eyes darting between the two men. Marcus offered her a reassuring smile. "Just a neighborly chat." Jeff glared at him, his frustration bubbling over as he stomped back to his house, muttering under his breath. But as the door closed behind him, a nagging unease began to settle in. Something about Marcus's calm demeanor didn't sit right with him. It wasn't fear or submission. It was confidence. The next morning, Jeff's phone buzzed with a neighborhood group chat notification. He opened it to see a message from Mrs. Clark, who had apparently struck up a conversation with Marcus after their tense encounter. The message read, "Looks like we've got someone special in our midst. Our new neighbor Marcus is the new chief of police for the city. What an honor to have him here." Jeff stared at the screen, his mind reeling. Chief of police? His face turned pale as the implications sank in. But before he could process the full weight of this revelation, a sharp knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His heart sank. Through the peephole, he saw Marcus standing on his porch, a calm but unmistakably authoritative expression on his face. Jeff's hand hovered over the doorknob, his mind racing with excuses and denials. But as the knock came again, firm and unyielding, he knew there was no avoiding the confrontation to come. Jeff hesitated, his breath shallow as the second knock reverberated through the door. He thought about pretending he wasn't home, but that would only delay the inevitable. Marcus knew he was there, of course he did. With trembling hands, Jeff finally unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to peer out. There stood Marcus, his broad frame casting a shadow over the threshold. His posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. He wasn't smiling, but his expression wasn't hostile either. It was unreadable, which somehow made Jeff feel even more on edge. "Good morning, Jeff," Marcus said, his tone polite but firm. "Do you have a moment to talk?" Jeff blinked, thrown off by the directness. Yeah, sure," he stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. He opened the door wider, but didn't invite Marcus inside. Instead, he stepped onto the porch, crossing his arms defensively. Marcus glanced at the neatly trimmed lawn, and then back at Jeff, his eyes steady. "I wanted to clear the air between us. It seems we got off on the wrong foot." Jeff felt a surge of annoyance. The calmness in Marcus's voice was disarming, and he didn't like feeling off balance. "I don't know what you mean," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Let's not dance around it. I've noticed how closely you've been watching me since I moved in. I understand neighbors can be protective of their community, but I think there's more to it than that. Am I wrong?" Jeff's mouth opened, but no words came out. He wasn't used to being confronted so directly. "I'm just looking out for the neighborhood," he said, finally, his tone defensive. Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained serious. "That's fair. I value a safe community too. It's part of my job, after all." Jeff felt his stomach twist. There it was again, that reminder that Marcus wasn't just another neighbor. He was the police chief, someone with authority, someone who could unravel all the assumptions Jeff had clung to for years. "I didn't know you were," Jeff began, but trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence without sounding foolish or worse. Marcus nodded as if he understood the unspoken words. "Most people don't. I didn't go around announcing it. I believe in earning trust through actions, not titles." Jeff shifted uncomfortably, his defenses cracking under the weight of Marcus's calm demeanor. He felt exposed, as though Marcus could see straight through him. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "I want to make something clear. I moved here because I believed this was a good place to live, a place where my family and I could feel welcome. I hope that's not a mistake." Jeff flinched at the subtle weight of the statement. He glanced down at the porch floor, his throat tightening. The truth was, he didn't have a good reason for his behavior. It had been rooted in fear, ignorance, and a stubborn refusal to confront his own prejudices. But admitting that, even to himself, was a bridge too far. Jeff started, his voice faltering. "I didn't know anything about you. It's not personal." Marcus' expression softened, but his tone carried a firm edge. "Maybe not, but your actions have consequences. A call to the police without cause puts people in danger. Did you think about that?" Jeff's eyes snapped up to meet Marcus's. He opened his mouth to argue, but found he couldn't. Deep down, he knew Marcus was right. He had acted impulsively, fueled by baseless assumptions. Before Jeff could respond, the sound of a car pulling into Marcus's driveway drew both their attention. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop, and a woman stepped out, holding the hand of a young boy. She had an air of quiet elegance, a smile warm as she leaned down to speak to the child. Marcus's face lit up, the tension melting away as he turned toward his family. "Excuse me," he said to Jeff, his tone polite, but signaling the conversation was over. Jeff watched as Marcus crossed the street to greet his wife and son. They exchanged a few words before heading inside, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. For the first time, Jeff felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt, not yet, but it was close. He stood there on the porch, staring after them, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. That night, Jeff sat alone in his living room, the glow of the television flickering against the walls. He wasn't really watching. His mind kept drifting back to Marcus. The man's calm confidence, his refusal to rise to provocation, his unwavering dignity. All of it gnawed at Jeff's conscience. He thought about the 911 call, the confrontation in the driveway, the way he had treated Marcus, as though he didn't belong. The memory of Marcus's family laughing together lingered in his mind, a stark contrast to the anger and suspicion Jeff had harbored. For the first time, Jeff wondered if he had been wrong, not just about Marcus, but about the way he saw the world. It was an uncomfortable thought, one he wasn't ready to face fully. But it was there, gnawing at the edges of his mind, refusing to be ignored. Meanwhile, across the street, Marcus sat at his dining room table, his son's laughter echoing from the next room. His wife placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression concerned. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Marcus nodded, though his gaze was distant. "Just thinking about the conversation I had with Jeff today. There's a lot of fear there, a lot of misunderstanding." She sighed, squeezing his shoulder gently. "You can't fix everyone, Marcus. Some people just aren't ready to change." "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean I'll stop trying." As the night deepened, the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet rhythm. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension remained, weaving its way through the streets, pulling the lives of its residents into a web of conflict and introspection. For Jeff, the days ahead would bring challenges he hadn't anticipated. And for Marcus, the road to building trust in his new community would require patience, resilience, and a willingness to confront the very biases that threatened to divide them. Neither man could see what lay ahead, but the choices they made would shape not only their lives, the fabric of the neighborhood they shared. The days that followed were a strange mix of normalcy and tension for Jeff. He went about his routines, mowing the lawn, chatting with familiar neighbors, and sipping his morning coffee on the porch. Yet every time he glanced toward Marcus's house, a weight settled on his chest. Marcus's presence was a constant reminder of that uncomfortable conversation. Jeff told himself he was just trying to move on, but deep down, he knew something was shifting within him. He couldn't stop replaying Marcus's words in his mind, especially the part about consequences. One evening, as Jeff sat in his living room, his wife, Linda, walked in, her arms crossed. She hadn't noticed Jeff's distant demeanor over the past week. "You've been quiet lately," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Is something bothering you?" Jeff hesitated, unsure how to explain what was gnawing at him. Linda wasn't someone who tolerated excuses, especially not when it came to Jeff's tendencies to jump to conclusions. "It's nothing," he said, avoiding her gaze. Linda raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Does this have anything to do with Marcus?" she asked, her tone pointed. Jeff's head snapped up. "What makes you think that?" She leaned forward, her voice steady. "Because I know you. You've been acting strange ever since they moved in. You've barely talked about anything else." Jeff sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not just that," he admitted reluctantly. "I made some assumptions about him, okay? I thought he was trouble, but he's not. He's the police chief, Linda. The police chief." Linda's expression softened, but her eyes were still sharp. "And what?" That makes him different somehow. What about before you knew that? Jeff shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, he muttered. Maybe I was wrong about him. Maybe I've been wrong about a lot of things. Linda reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You can't change the past, Jeff, but you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward. Maybe it's time you started with an apology. Jeff frowned. The idea of apologizing to Marcus made his stomach churn, but Linda's words stuck with him. He had always prided himself on being a good neighbor, a decent person, yet his actions toward Marcus told a different story. Across the street, Marcus was dealing with challenges of his own. Despite his calm exterior, the move had been anything but easy. There had been whispered comments from other neighbors, sideways glances when he walked into the local grocery store. He had expected some resistance, but it didn't make it any easier. Marcus sat in his home office, staring at a stack of paperwork. His wife entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, she said, setting a mug in front of him. He smiled faintly, taking a sip, just thinking about everything. Moving here was supposed to be a fresh start, but it feels like I'm still fighting the same battles. She sat down beside him, her gaze steady. You've always said that change starts small. Maybe Jeff is your starting point here. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. He's not the only one, you know. There are others, subtle in their ways, but they're watching, waiting for me to mess up. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Then don't give them that satisfaction. You've worked too hard to let their ignorance define you. The next day, Jeff decided to take Linda's advice. He walked over to Marcus's house, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the door, he hesitated, second-guessing his decision. But before he could turn back, the door opened, and Marcus stood there, his expression unreadable. Jeff, Marcus said, his tone neutral. What can I do for you? Jeff swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his own discomfort. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I've treated you since you moved in. Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. That's unexpected, he said, though his voice lacked sarcasm. Jeff nodded, his hands fidgeting. I judged you before I knew anything about you. That was wrong. And well, I'm trying to be better about things like that. There was a pause, a charged silence that stretched between them. Then Marcus nodded slowly. I appreciate that, Jeff, he said. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. For a moment, Jeff felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. As he turned to leave, a voice called out from the sidewalk. Well, isn't this heartwarming? Said a man Jeff recognized as one of the more vocal neighbors. A gruff man named Harold. Didn't think you'd be cozying up to the new guy so soon, Jeff. Jeff froze, his face flushing with embarrassment. Harold smirked, crossing his arms. Careful, Marcus, he added, his tone laced with condescension. Jeff's a bit of a softy. Don't take advantage of him. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. Is there something you need, Harold? He asked evenly. Harold chuckled, shaking his head. Just making conversation. Don't mind me. He walked off, whistling a tune that seemed to mock the tension he left behind. Jeff looked at Marcus, unsure of what to say. I'm sorry about him, he muttered. Marcus shrugged, though his eyes were hard. I've dealt with worse. As Jeff walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that his apology, while a step in the right direction, wasn't enough. The undercurrents of resentment and prejudice in the neighborhood were deeper than he realized. Back inside his home, Jeff sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts swirling. He had taken the first step, but he knew the journey ahead would be complicated, not just for him, but for the entire community. What he didn't know was how much more complicated it was about to get. The days rolled on, and the neighborhood seemed to simmer with unspoken tension. Jeff noticed the subtle shifts around him. The way Harold and a few others whispered amongst themselves when Marcus was outside, the pointed looks, the too loud laughter that followed their remarks. It was as if Marcus's very presence had stirred something deep and ugly within certain people, and Jeff couldn't help but feel complicit. He wanted to believe his apology had been enough, that he'd done his part. But the truth was much heavier. Each time he saw Marcus tending to his garden or playing with his kids in the yard, Jeff was reminded of the unwelcome stares and the whispered slurs he'd once shared with the same neighbors, now fueling the tension. It wasn't just Harold. There were more of them, their subtle actions growing bolder as days passed. One evening, just after dusk, Jeff was sitting on his porch, watching the street lights flicker on. The air was thick with humidity, and a strange quiet had settled over the neighborhood. From across the street, Marcus's house glowed softly, the sound of laughter spilling out through the open windows. His family seemed untouched by the hostility outside, or at least they pretended to be. Jeff's stomach twisted as he noticed Harold and a couple of other neighbors gathered a few houses down. They were speaking in hushed tones, their faces tight with something that looked dangerously close to malice. Jeff couldn't make out their words, but the occasional glance toward Marcus's house told him enough. The knot in his stomach tightened. He felt torn, a deep sense of responsibility gnawing at him. Should he step in? Say something? Or was it too late? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. "Hey there, Jeff," Harold said as he and another man, Frank, sauntered up the driveway. Their smiles were thin, their friendliness forced. "Out enjoying the night?" Jeff nodded cautiously. "Something like that?" "You too." Harold chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down Jeff's spine. "Just keeping an eye on things, you know. Making sure everything stays peaceful around here." Jeff's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Frank smirked, leaning casually against the porch railing. "Come on, Jeff. Don't tell me you haven't noticed. Ever since Marcus moved in, it feels like the whole dynamic of the neighborhood's changed. People are on edge. Doesn't feel right." Jeff felt his pulse quicken. "Marcus hasn't done anything wrong," he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "He's just living his life." Harold's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Maybe, maybe not. But people talk, Jeff. And when people talk, things have a way of escalating." Jeff stood, his fists clenching at his sides. "If you're planning something, Harold, don't. Whatever you're thinking, just leave him and his family alone." Harold held up his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Jeff. Nobody's planning anything. We're just concerned citizens. But maybe you should think about whose side you're on. People don't take kindly to those who stick their necks out for the wrong cause." The two men walked away, their laughter echoing into the night. Jeff sank back into his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was brewing, and he was powerless to stop it. Across the street, Marcus sat in his living room, reviewing files from work. His wife had just put the kids to bed, and the house was finally quiet. But as he worked, he couldn't ignore the prickling sensation of being watched. He glanced out the window and saw Harold and his group lingering down the street, their shadows stretching under the dim streetlights. Marcus's jaw tightened. He had dealt with men like them before, small-minded individuals who thrived on intimidation and fear. But this time, it felt personal. He'd had whispers at the station too, rumors about certain neighbors and their dissatisfaction with his arrival. He brushed it off at first, but now the pieces were starting to form a troubling picture. The next morning, Jeff woke to an unusual stillness. As he stepped outside to grab the newspaper, he noticed a group of neighbors gathered near Marcus's house. His heart sank when he saw the graffiti sprayed across Marcus's garage door, GTOT. Jeff froze, the weight of his own guilt crashing down on him. He should have done something. He should have spoken up. But now it was too late. He watched as Marcus stepped outside, his face calm, but his eyes betraying the hurt and anger simmering beneath the surface. Jeff wanted to say something, to apologize again, but the words caught in his throat. He felt like a coward, hiding behind the safety of his silence, while Marcus faced the brunt of the neighborhood's hostility. That night, Marcus called a neighborhood meeting. Jeff wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew he had to be there. The room was tense, filled with neighbors exchanging uneasy glances. Marcus stood at the front, his presence commanding but not overbearing. "I want to address what's been happening," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm. "This is my home now, just like it's yours. My family deserves to feel safe and welcome here, just like yours do. If anyone has a problem with me, I'd rather you say it to my face than hide behind actions like this morning's vandalism." The room was silent. Harold and his group avoided eye contact, their postures stiff. Jeff felt the tension in the air, the unspoken conflicts threatening to boil over. But before anyone could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Marcus's phone buzzed, and his expression darkened as he read the message. Without a word, he left the meeting, his urgency leaving everyone in stunned silence. Jeff followed him outside, unable to contain his curiosity. "Marcus, what's going on?" he asked. Marcus hesitated, his eyes scanning the street. "There's been a break-in at the station," he said finally, "and I have a feeling it's connected to what's happening here." Jeff's stomach dropped. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was far more dangerous than he'd imagined. And as Marcus drove off into the night, Jeff couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning.